Hello, good afternoon and welcome to the fourth lecture in the 2023 Royal Army's Summer Lecture Series. I'm Mark Bennett, I'm the Museum's Research Manager. Thank you for joining us today. Hello to everyone at home. Apologies for the slight delay in starting. We had some audio issues and we wanted to get it right before we came live. The Royal Army's, for those of you who don't already know, is the UK's national collection of arms and armour. It began life as a medieval stockpile of weapons at the Tower of London, but by the early 19th century was expanding its collection to include representative examples of Greek and Roman armour. The museum now operates from 3 sites in London, Leeds and Portsmouth, all of which are now operating our summer programme. For more details, go to our website, which is royalarmies.org. Today, however, we're here for the museum's Summer Lecture Series, which features contributions from those just starting out their academic career. If you missed the previous talks in the series, then they are available to watch again on YouTube. If you're interested in future events, visit our website to sign up to watch via Zoom, or subscribe to our YouTube channel where they'll appear live and as video on demand. After the event, we'll be taking questions from both the Zoom Q&A function and the YouTube chat. Send them in as they occur to you, and I will put them to the speaker after the talk. The sooner you get them in, the more easily I can fit them into the programme, so bear that in mind. I can't guarantee to get through them all, and I can't guarantee just to do the popular ones, but we will try and do as many as we can. There are also captions. If you're hard of hearing, there should be CC functions in both Zoom and YouTube. If you have any technical issues, then leaving and rejoining or refreshing the page tends to work. With all the technical considerations out of the way, let's turn to today's event, one which I think it's fair to say has been a long time in gestation, but is well worth waiting for.
Like most things in life.
Now, although the museum only has a limited quantity of ancient material, in fact, when we did buy an ancient armour in the mid-1850s, with the proceeds of ticket sales, it turned out we'd been in stiff competition with another national museum, and there were accusations of wasting public money. However, our remit does include warfare throughout history. The more that we understand earlier periods, the more that we can understand warfare as a constant human experience. Well, to tell us more about one early period, we have Dr. Alastair Lumsden. Alastair recently completed his doctorate at the University of St Andrews, looking in part at grave goods from Gallic burial sites to learn more about wider society and warfare in this period. But without any further ado, over to you, Alastair.
Right. Thanks, Mark, and thank you to the Royal Armouries for having me. I'm just going to get straight into it once the slide catches up. There we go. So this paper explores the military capabilities of the people of Cisalpine Gaul, otherwise known as Northern Italy, from the arrival of Gallic groups in the 4th century BC to the Roman conquest of the region in the 180s. But before I get into that, we first need to establish who the Gauls were and what Cisalpine Gaul was like. And more importantly, how this differed from the Greek and Roman depictions of them, which have contributed to the Gauls being perceived as backwards barbarians. Now, as unfortunate and problematic as they are, because the Gauls didn't write their own histories, and the Greek and Roman literary and artistic media is the first point of contact we all have, let us begin with how they perceive them, and then I'm going to get on to the more nuanced archaeological view that we get of the Gauls. So essentially, Greek and Roman sources depict the Gauls as Vikings, and that is to say, hard-drinking, long-haired, mustachioid, physically imposing warriors who collected severed heads and fought with reckless courage and animalistic ferocity. And like the Vikings, the Gauls suddenly appeared without warning and embedded themselves into the Greco-Roman psyche by committing 2 sacrilegious acts: the sacking of the city of Rome in 390 or 87, depending on which calendar you use, and the most important religious sanctuary in Greece, the Temple of Apollo at Delphi in 279. Now, despite these victories, the Gauls were regarded as tactically naive and totally reliant on the use of a powerful mass charge at the outset of battle. However, they were ultimately unable to sustain this initial onslaught when faced with the fortitude and measured discipline of Roman and Greek armies. And this perception is best exemplified by Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who recorded that the barbarians' manner of fighting, being in large measure that of wild beasts and frenzied, was an erratic procedure quite lacking in military science. Now, if we look at the slide there, the Greeks and Romans perceived the Gauls as severely deficient in all 4 levels of military operations. So just to briefly touch on it: technical, tactical, operational, and strategic. and bear that in mind because I'm going to swing back around to this later in the talk. Now, we have to recognize that these depictions of Gallic society was viewed in much the same derogatory light, with Polybius providing a scathing assessment of Cisalpine Gaul. And I'm going to paraphrase this for you. Essentially, they lived in unwalled villages, slept on beds of leaves, and had no knowledge of art or science. Now, we have to recognize that these depictions of the Gauls were constructed through the rose-tinted lenses of a Greek and Roman sense of cultural, ethnic, and military superiority. And this has the potential to mislead our perception of them. Indeed, if we look closer at Polybius's statement, we find that it is a gross oversimplification. Yes, settlement patterns do reveal that northern Italy contained a number of small, dispersed settlements which were unlikely to have defensive fortifications. But at the same time, other ancient authors specifically inform us that the Gauls did live in these large fortified settlements, and indeed the Roman conquest of northern Italy, we are told, was only completed after a series of sieges, which denotes the presence of walls. And this also aligns with the archaeological record, which demonstrates that Transalpine European groups, so those north of the Alps, had been inhabiting large fortified settlements with ever-increasing but varied degrees of urban characteristics from 6th century BC onwards. And the derogatory trend towards the Gauls continued with one of the most famous observations of Gallic military equipment, where Polybius stated that their swords had rounded tips, making them useless for thrusting, and that they were prone to bending. Now, albeit they are severely limited in scale and scope, modern studies have shown that around 36% of these Gallic swords could have bent on impact. But at the same time, there's been no equivalent study on Italic and Greek swords to compare them, so we don't really know if they were inferior or not. But what we do need to consider is that the Romans would adopt a slew of Gallic-style military equipment, the most prominent of which was the stabbing sword, the gladius hispaniensis, which had a blade length of 55 to 65 centimeters and was modeled on the Latin I Gallic sword, constructed with Celtiberian techniques, otherwise known as the Gauls in Spain. We also know that although Gallic swords did become longer from 250 BC onwards, with the Latin II sword having a blade of between 75 and 85 centimeters, these weapons still retained tips that rendered them suitable for slashing and thrusting, and coincidentally, this would become the model for the later Roman cavalry sword, the spatha. Other examples of the Romans adopting Gallic military technology included mail, which was the most advanced piece of body armor in the last 2 centuries BC. And from the 1st century AD, Roman imperial cavalry would use Gallic training exercises and techniques. So what I'm trying to get across here is that it's important to understand that on a basic level, Gallic military technology was equally advanced as Rome's, albeit they didn't have torsion artillery. So in light of all this problematic Greek and Roman evidence, who really were the Gauls? Well, in short, they were a collection of peoples who belonged to what is termed the Latin cultural sphere and would eventually populate most of Europe from the British Isles to central Turkey. Now, Latin is not a term these people would have used to identify themselves. Instead, it originates from the large collection of goods discovered at the site of Latin in what is southern Switzerland. And Latin culture is broadly characterized by a combination of specific artistic wares, burial practices, settlement types, and of course, weaponry, all of which begin to emerge at the expense of those used during the preceding Hallstatt cultural period in the late 5th century. So around 400 BC, Gallic groups began entering northern Italy, and this is visible in the archaeological record, with inhumation burials replacing cremations as the dominant funerary rite. And of course, we get the appearance of Latin-style goods. Now, it's important to recognize that these migrations were not monolithic movements of hundreds of thousands of people like that occurred in the later Roman Empire with the Goths and Vandals, but rather that they were far smaller in scale and would continue to occur over the course of the next 2 centuries. Therefore, although I'm going to focus on the 4 largest tribes in northern Italy, it is crucial to be aware that despite the fact that ancient authors portray them as large, united tribal entities, when they first arrived in northern Italy, they were, in all probability, a heterogeneous collection of groups who varied in size and geographical origin that banded together to migrate. Now, I'm just going to step slightly to the side here, because it's important to briefly kind of outline this. Is the way that Gallic society was structured enabled these types of migrations to occur. So situated at the core of Gallic society were the local communities, where kinship groups and the naturally occurring hierarchies within them played a central role in their immediate governance. A number of these smaller communities were bound together in a pagus or a clan, and a collection of these pagi comprised the tribe. Ancient authors tell us that the pagi had the autonomy to make their own political decisions, and we are told that one of them was the freedom to migrate away from the larger tribe should they see fit. And on a basic military level, this is the division of the army, right? So you fought in your family unit, your community, your clan, your tribe. And as I'm going to demonstrate later, when these loosely affiliated groups developed a collective identity and centralized institutions of power, they significantly increased their military capabilities. So on that note, let us turn to the four major tribal units. The Senones occupied the southeast, assimilating themselves with the local Italic Piceni. And according to Roman tradition, it was the Senones who defeated the Romans at the Battle of Alia and would go on to sack the city itself. But what's interesting from an archaeological perspective here is that amongst the Senones, if Latin-style goods, and by that I mean namely swords and fibula or brooches, are removed, then their funerary assemblages or the goods that they were buried with show virtually no signs of being Gallic. Meanwhile, to their north were the Boii, who are centered around modern-day Bologna, and they established themselves amongst the former Etruscan settlements, and this is reflected in their burial assemblages, where they are characterized by a much more even split between Gallic, Italic, and Etruscan goods. Moving north of the River Po were the Cenomani, with their capital at Brescia, and then Subres, with their capital at Milan. Now, in contrast to the tribes south of the Po, the cemeteries for both of these groups have a virtual absence of Italic groups until very late in the piece, so turn of the 2nd century, and are characterized by the continued deposition of local Gaulic and Latin goods. So what we can see from these burials is that Cisalpine Gaul was never truly Gallic, rather that these migrant Gauls assimilated with local cultural groups to create a highly culturally diverse region. Unfortunately for us, due to the constant occupation of these major northern Italian cities, we have very little evidence of how the peoples of Cisalpine Gaul evolved in a social and military sense. Therefore, if the Greek and Roman sources are as problematic as they are, and we have very little settlement archaeology to guide us, the question then arises, how do we move the needle forward and obtain a sense of social and military development? Well, the answer to that is that we have to construct a model that supports it. And our best evidence for looking at this is the goods that people were buried with and how this changed over time. And this is crucially important because the goods that you were buried with in the Iron Age, like delineated the individual's age, authority, status, and wealth. And the combinations of and when this changes, it is in reaction to broader socio-political and military developments. So in order to observe these changes, I collated the data from the funerary assemblages of weapon burials in the largest, most well-documented cemeteries in Cisalpine Gaul and subjected them to a variety of statistical analyses. But for the purposes of this paper, I want to focus on what is perhaps the most striking feature, and that is the fact that between 400 and 180, weapon burials decreased by 25% and sword burials were reduced by 44%. Now, to understand what these changes heralded, it is beneficial to compare these results with other contemporary tribal groups of whose socio-political and military developments we are better informed of. By doing so, we can observe similar patterns of change, and from this, a plausible model emerges, which illustrates that the changes in the way that elite masculine ideology was expressed in funerary contexts represented aristocratic responses to the development of more sophisticated socio-political and military institutions in northern Italy. So if we look at the slide there, between the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC, there was a significant reduction in weapon burials and funerary expenditure or wealth amongst the Celtiberians and Transalpine Gauls, who are of course part of the Latin sphere. And this happens a little bit earlier with the Samnites, who are in a central and southern Italic people from the late 5th century onwards. Now, these changes coincided with the emergence of locally minted coinage and the development of large fortified settlements, otherwise known as oppida, which featured urban-like characteristics. Where population groups and settlements were previously organized according to a hierarchical model, oppida functioned as the administrative, political, and religious centers that controlled a territory with hierarchically organized lesser forms of settlements. As such, the emergence of these settlements and associated developments provide a window into the development of a centralized tribal state. Moreover, because political and military authority was now obtained by the consensus of the majority of elites drawn from across the wider tribe, not merely the clan or the community, it helped establish a centralized hierarchy of command that was recognized by a tribe. When this was transferred to the battlefield, it enabled commanders to exercise more control over units led by subordinate aristocrats who may have been previously hard to control because they were leaders of a familial or a community-based force, and to whom fighting for a collective purpose was of lesser importance. So in this sense, early Gallic tribal forces were organized in a comparable fashion to Roman armies during the regal and early Republican periods. An example of this is the annihilation of the Fabii clan at the Battle of the Crimea River in 478 BC, after they attempted to wage a private war against the Etruscan city of Veii. And what this suggests is that when Rome was beginning to develop its centralized political and military structure in the 5th and 6th centuries, Roman clans could operate independently of the wider community. Now, the early military autonomy of the gentes, or the Roman clans, potentially helped establish the ideology which led to the later independent nature of the maniples. And for you, those of you who don't know, the maniple is the basic tactical infantry unit of the Manipular Legion. Yet despite this freedom, when required, Roman clans recognized a hierarchy of command that transcended their familial structure in battle and were capable of coherently operating together. Meanwhile, the evolution of Rome's military and political bureaucracy from the 6th century onwards increased the aristocratic and plebeian recognition of and adherence to this command hierarchy. Fostering this ideology of civic political obedience resulted in Roman armies increasingly operating with greater military capabilities. So I guess what I'm trying to get across here is that the changes in Cisalpine burial assemblages suggest that the Gauls also developed increasingly formalized socio-political mechanisms sometime during the 3rd century, and that these changes fostered a comparable ideology of accepting a hierarchy of command that extended beyond their immediate clan or community. In other words, at some point during the 3rd century, the various clans or communities of the federated tribes, like the Senones, had established a collective tribal identity, and aristocrats now accepted that collaboration was the best way for them to obtain power within the new political and military structure of the wider tribe. When this recognition of higher authority manifested itself on the battlefield, it increased the coordination and tactical sophistication of large armies drawn from various communities. So now that all the background's out of the way, let us now turn to how Gallic forces were potentially organized and fought. The funerary assemblages suggest at their most basic level, the Gallic order of battle and troop types had a strong parallel with that of the model of the Roman armies during the early Republican period. Fighting with similarly styled helmets, shields, swords, spears, and shanked javelins. In all likelihood meant that engagements began with light armed troops exchanging javelins at a range of about 30 meters out in front of the more heavily armed warriors before the battle escalated to combat between the main infantry lines. And it's important that we remember that the Romans themselves adopted the Montefortino helmet, the heavier shank javelin, and the Latin one-style swords used by the Cisalpine Gauls in this period. But what's even more crucial is that these pieces of military equipment were very, very similar to that used throughout the Italian peninsula during the same period. And as we see on the slide there, several different cultural groups in Italy developed open-faced helmets with hinged cheek pieces in the 4th century. And when we take all of this together with the use of shank javelins and distinctive oblong shields, it suggests that there was a comparable style of fighting adhered to throughout the Italian peninsula and indeed the wider Western Mediterranean, albeit with nuanced regional and cultural differences, one of which may have been a Gallic aggression. So like the Manipular Legion, the tactical function of Gallic warriors were determined by a combination of age, social class, and wealth. And just a quick caveat here, I guess the key to understanding armies at this point, be it Roman or anything throughout the entire Western Mediterranean, is that they are a military manifestation of a social hierarchy. So out in front were the velites, they were the youngest and most lightly armed, while the hastati and principes were arranged in progressively older, wealthier, and more heavily armed ranks, until we get to the triarii, who were the oldest and most heavily armed. An osteological analysis at the cemetery of Monte Barbarian, which is just south of Bologna, has shown that a similar pattern occurred in northern Italy, with younger men being the demographic most likely to be buried with javelins. And although we need to remain constantly aware, especially with archaeology and its interpretation, that the weapons that people were buried with may not necessarily give us an accurate reflection of what they fought with on the battlefield, but they do delineate a hierarchy in a social class. And from that, we can kind of infer that the youngest did fight as skirmishers, like the velites, or potentially as dual-purpose infantry if they're a little bit older, like the hastati. Now, in contrast at Monte Barbarian, males aged between 25 and 60 were typically buried with melee weapons. And these burials were also the most likely to be the wealthiest, which suggests that like the principe and triarii of the Manipular Legion, these men functioned as more heavily armed, dual-purpose, or simply line infantry. So how were Gallic units potentially organized then? Well, the prominent place of weaponry in burials and the relationship between elites and their warrior identity, claims to authority and status, enabled these men and their armed retainers, otherwise known as ambacti, to provide Gallic forces with a core of well-trained warriors. And if we look at the reported size of Cisalpine Gallic forces in the 3rd century, we see that the scale of warfare had increased. And again, this is a trend we see throughout the Italian peninsula and the wider Western Mediterranean. But what this meant is that warfare was increasingly becoming no longer the realm of elite males and their retainers, and lesser men were now expected to become involved with greater frequency. These poorer men would have been generally less well trained and more lightly equipped. And while their precise role is unknown, if we look at Polybius's characterization of the Roman velites and Tacitus's description that the javelin was the first weapon given to Germanic youths, it again renders it probable that the youngest fought as skirmishers. But what's more problematic is determining how older adult males from the lower sections of society were integrated into battle formations. And there is little evidence which indicates that they experience a similar trajectory of development as older elite males did as they age. So, you know, jumping up through the ranks from velitae to triarii. However, the reality is that as these men aged, they would have become less physically agile, which reduced their effectiveness as light infantry, and therefore it is probable that a large proportion of them fought simply as line infantry. So, considering this, I propose that Gallic units were organized differently depending on how they approach combat. And a little caveat here, I'm not breaking and reinventing the wheel with this. This is essentially how the Manipular Legion worked, and other more erudite scholars than I, such as Fernando Quesada Sanz, Jeremy Armstrong, and Ted Lendon, have all postulated similar models and applied them to the Celtiberians and the Romans. All I'm doing is mapping it on to the Cisalpine Gauls. So when the Gauls intended to act offensively, the more heavily armed males positioned themselves in the front ranks, where their skill could be most effectively used. Meanwhile, the lesser men were positioned towards the rear. And here, if we follow Adrian Goldsworthy's model of combat during the mid-Republican period, if neither side broke during this initial melee, then both sides would retire and reform after about 10 to 20 minutes of combat. By deploying the less capable fighters or simply lower class spearmen as a screen at this stage, it could have enabled the wealthier and more skilled warriors to regroup and retain their ability to influence the battle later. This also meant that should the enemy seek to shower them with missiles, it was going to be the poorer people who were going to absorb them and not the more effective infantry. Alternatively, if there was no formal division between light and heavier infantry, the skirmishers may have initially fought out in front of the line infantry and then retired behind them when the melee began, using their numbers to lend support. Then when the heavier infantry withdrew from combat, these lighter units could also filter forwards to either engage in a skirmish or provide a screen to dissuade the enemy from pushing forwards during this side of the engagement. So I told you I was going to swing back around to this. So now I'm going to briefly touch on what I consider are the overlooked aspects of the Gauls' actions and some of the major engagements over the course of the 3rd centuries, and see how they fit into these 4 levels of military operations. So again, just a brief reminder: technical, tactical, operational, strategic. But before we do that, we need to acknowledge that later Roman literary sources of the Gauls in battle are brief and of course written by the hand of the victor. However, these events were codified, and although authors could take some liberties, they also had to adhere to what may have become an accepted synopsis of actual memories from fighting against the Gauls. So in that sense, I think it's beneficial when we're approaching the question of what were the military capabilities of the Gauls, is to ask ourselves the question, well, what did they do to win? Because understandably, due to the nature of our evidence, we're predisposed to look at it, read it, and look at it and be like, well, that's what the Romans did, and look what the Gauls couldn't do. And I firmly believe therein lies the road to madness. So there we go, right. So I'm going to begin with the Battle of Sentinum in 295. So Sentinum presents the first detailed account of Cisalpine Gallic forces in action, and more importantly, there is no mention of the Gauls employing a massed infantry charge, as they had at the Battle of Alia and retired after the sack of Rome a century earlier. Rather, their infantry stoutly held its formation throughout a day of heavy fighting. Standards are mentioned for the first time, suggesting that the Gauls were not a disorganized amorphous force, and perhaps alluding to the use of rudimentary formations. Cavalry and chariot units were fielded, with the latter being consciously held back while the mounted units on both sides engaged in a series of skirmishes. And then when the Roman forces overextended themselves, they were reportedly surprised by a force of Gallic chariots, which may suggest that the chariots were being used as a strategic reserve. But what's really particularly remarkable about the Gallic use of chariots in this battle is their restraint, which runs counter to the motif that the Gauls really exercised this in battle. Now, cavalry were typically recruited from the wealthiest classes, and the increased costs involved in maintaining a chariot suggest that the charioteers were the most powerful males in the Gallic army. Thus, we are possibly presented with the first glimpse of a change in elite masculine mentality and military capabilities, with aristocratic men now potentially commanding from the rear rather than the front. And this is super important because commanding from the rear, your authority is already respected enough that you don't have to lead from the front. But it's super beneficial because you can react, so it gives you greater tactical flexibility. Now, this also coincides with the fact that from this point on, Cisalpine Gallic warriors are never mentioned as looking to challenge the Romans in duels, as they had done previously, and nor are their armies depicted as being solely reliant on the use of a massed infantry charge at the outset of battle. Indeed, the only other reference we get of a Gallic force using a wild mass charge is in the final moments of the Battle of Telamon in 225. And even then, and this is super important to emphasize, it was the Transalpine Gestati, not the Cisalpine Gauls, who in comparison doggedly fought on while attempting to withdraw in an orderly fashion. And the same thing occurs at Centenum, where it was the Italic Samnites who broke first, leaving the Gauls to continue to fight the Romans alone. And again, in this situation, they reportedly fought with both discipline and stamina. Now, Centenum is unusual in another aspect, in that Livy claims that the Gallic force used the testudo or tortoise formation. And while it is highly unlikely that this is the testudo we all recognize today on the slide, I would like to suggest two plausible alternatives that the Gauls may have used. Now, again, a little bit of a caveat here. Livy's use of military terminology was never beyond reproach. And he interchanges the term testudo with phalanx, or a dense body of spearmen. And his use of the latter might present a more accurate reflection of the Gauls' actions. Again, this formation was unlikely to have resembled the rigidly formed rank and file of the Greek phalanx, but may instead reflect that the Gallic front lines could close their files and overlap their shields in a united wall or rudimentary phalanx formation. And this is similar to how the Roman triarii fought and later Germanic groups fought when they were under pressure too. So it's not that unusual. Now, apologies for the depiction of a really, really bad TV show. But secondly, if the Gauls were already fighting in a tight shield wall formation, it is possible that they were able to protect the first few ranks from javelins by creating something akin to the later Anglo-Saxon or Norse wahaga, otherwise known as a battle hedge. Conceivably, this maneuver could be carried out quickly by the entire front line of individual units, reasonably quickly without causing too much disruption amongst the rear ranks. And unlike the Roman testudo, you don't need the coordination because the Roman testudo is designed to get you up to a city wall. This is a static formation, so yeah, not as much training. But regardless of precisely how the Gauls attempted to protect themselves, their actions during the battle suggest that they were more than just an ill-disciplined, poorly organized, tactically one-dimensional barbarian horde, but were rather a largely well-trained, multifaceted, cohesive fighting force. So moving on to the siege of Iridium. So the Senones besieged the city of Iridium in 284 and defeat a Roman relief force. And I believe this provides some insight into the level of socio-political development and military capability at the beginning of the 3rd century. Ancient authors tell us that the Senones were the only Gallic group recorded as participating in this event, and that they were perhaps unable to undertake this incursion may reveal that they had developed a reasonable degree of tribal unity by the first quarter of the 3rd century, which in turn enabled them to organize a military expedition on this scale. Now, we have to emphasize that sieges were complicated military operations and certainly not conducted on a whim, as they required a concerted logistical and organizational effort on multiple fronts. And for the range of tasks presented on the slide to be coordinated and effectively maintained, like they potentially were at Iridium, it required the general recognition of a central authority, which was something that was only likely acquired through tribal consensus. Now, a final aspect of the siege of Iridium that has largely escaped scholarly attention is its motivation. Sieges could, of course, be conducted purely to accumulate wealth or destroy a rival center, and neither can be discounted as a motivating factor here. But ancient authors recorded that the Senones were hired as mercenaries by the Etruscans. And while this holds true, it falls into the trope of the civilized people manipulating the childlike mind of the barbarian and removes all agency from the Gauls by dismissing the possibility that the Senones may have also been driven by an ambition to enlarge their territory or sphere of hegemony by gaining control of the settlement and its hinterland. And if we just step back from it all for a moment and just suppose that this was the motivation for the siege, in that case, it may suggest that the Senones were no longer a loosely affiliated tribal confederation, but that they developed a unified identity and were working with a collective purpose, which was a significant prerequisite towards the development of statehood. So now I'm going to touch on Telamon, which is perhaps the most famous battle involving the Cisalpine Gauls. And unfortunately, it owes much of this due to the presence of the Transalpine Gestati and the fact that they fought naked. But what I want to focus on is a series of events leading up to the battle, as they present one of the few recorded instances where a Gallic force demonstrated their capacity to develop and implement clear strategic aims and operational level capabilities. So in short, in response to Roman expansion, the Boian and Suebrys entered into an alliance. They formulated a plan to invade Latium with a force of 40,000 men and sent envoys over the Alps to recruit the Gestati, all of which are elements of grand strategy. In the days leading up to the battle, the Gallic forces repeatedly avoided being surprised by Roman forces approaching from multiple directions through the effective use of cavalry in a reconnaissance role. When the commanders were reportedly presented with this intelligence, they responded by making sound tactical decisions that nearly enabled them to invade 3 Roman forces on 3 separate occasions. And here I think it's important to just take a step outside of the Gallic argument. Much is made about Rome's military exceptionalism at this point in time. But this is where Rome truly was militarily exceptional, and that is to say, the operational and strategic level capabilities, which enabled them to mobilize and coordinate the logistics and movements of multiple armies, which ultimately overwhelmed their opponents. And all of this stemmed from their more sophisticated socio-political institutions and their alliance systems. Now, returning to the battle, when the Gauls were caught between the final 2 Roman armies, they deployed their infantry in 2 lines, each facing a Roman force, and had the discipline to refrain from breaking ranks and charging forwards. And we are told that many of them attempted to retreat in an orderly fashion while under javelin fire. And like the Battle of Centenum, it's worth re-emphasizing here, it was the Transalpine Gestati who charged and broke first. Now, there's just 2 other battles I want to quickly touch on. At Silverlatana in 216, the boy organized a sophisticated ambush by rigging trees to collapse either side of a forest road that the Romans were taking to Cremona. Now, for those of you who kind of are aware, this is very similar to the tactics that Arminius and the Germanic tribes used to annihilate the legions of Varus in the 1st century AD at the Battle of Teutoburg Forest or Teutoburg Wald. But it's especially reminiscent of it in the sense that of the logistical effort it required, which again points to the recognition of central authority, operational level military capabilities, mass mobilization of manpower, and discipline. Now, the final detailed engagement involving the Cisalpine Gauls is Cremona. So at Cremona, the Boii, the Insubres, and the Cenomani besiege the city and are confronted by a Roman consular army. Now, the Battle of Cremona is unusual for several reasons, of which I'm just going to touch on 2. So first, it presents a Gallic force using various tactical maneuvers in a single engagement. And secondly, they were commanded by the Carthaginian Hamilcar, who reportedly remained in the region following the Battle of the River Metaurus in 207. And this meant that Hamilcar had spent the best part of a decade living with the Gauls. And during this period, he would have had ample time to relay his military expertise to them. Unfortunately, the extent of Hamilcar's influence on the Gauls is difficult, near impossible to quantify. Yet the fact that he and not a Gaul was given command suggests that after having fought in Carthaginian armies in the Italian peninsula for over a decade, and by that I mean like Hannibal's armies, the Gauls were perhaps in the process of integrating aspects of Carthaginian warfare into their own. As for the battle, so the Gauls reportedly marched out to offer battle in an orderly fashion, and here Livy relays that their left wing surged forwards. But yet again, this is no chaotic charge. Instead, it appears to have been calculated, as the Romans had not fully formed their lines, and this attack was specifically targeted at the Roman right wings, which were the furthest forward and most disorganized. When this attack failed to break Roman lines, the Gauls reportedly changed tactics and deployed units to outflank the Romans. Here, Livy noted that this maneuver was simple because the Gauls vastly outnumbered the Romans, another kind of literary trope here. However, he also stated that this weakened the Gallic centre, which may have meant that the Gauls likely had reserve units waiting behind those already engaged in combat. Now, admittedly, it is possible that Hamilcar thinned his centre ranks and ordered this maneuver to be carried out during a lull in the fighting, but it would be much more advantageous to do so while the Romans were already engaged in combat. So, while Livy's account of the Gauls' tactics at Cremona lacks clarity, when their actions are situated alongside their performances throughout the 3rd century, a credible body of evidence emerges which suggests that they were probably deploying the heavier infantry in at least 2 lines. And then if we consider the possibility that the light infantry fought out in front of them again, then the Gallic tactical deployment is eerily similar to that of the Roman Manipular Legion. Now, there is just one brief thing I want to quickly touch on that affected military development, and that is mercenary service. So we know that Gallic mercenaries frequently served in Syracusan or Sicilian and Carthaginian armies between the 5th and 3rd centuries. And while not all of these men would have returned home, some would have. If these men were not aristocratic, they could have found employment as ambecti or armed retainers in the service of an aristocrat, and thus being able to transmit aspects of the more sophisticated Mediterranean armies to their fellow retainers with whom they presumably trained. Alternatively, if they were aristocratic, then they would have been in a prime position to have these ideas heard by those who wielded greater power and their capacity to implement aspects of them. So, in conclusion, one of the prerequisites for Roman armies becoming more tactically adept was the development of a centralized political bureaucracy and the recognition of authority given to the individual by the state, not merely the clan or community, in the 5th and 6th centuries. The changes in elite burial practices in northern Italy and the increasingly disciplined and tactically flexible performances of Gallic armies in the previously reviewed battle narratives suggest that similar changes only began to occur amongst the Cisalpine Gauls in the 4th and 3rd centuries. At Sentinum and Talamon, large Gallic forces fought with a greater level of discipline than their Samnite and Transalpine allies. And indeed, I didn't have time to get into this, but Hannibal's use of the Gauls at Cannae in 216 suggests that far from being ill-disciplined, the Gauls were conditioned to operating within large armies where discipline was an essential prerequisite for the use of higher echelon tactical maneuvers. Therefore, it appears that the reduction in weapon burials reflects aristocrats adapting how they express their authority in the midst of significant socio-political developments, which in turn enable them to experiment with and utilize more sophisticated military capabilities. And that's all, folks.
Thanks, Alastair. Yeah, come and join me for the Q&A session. To those who you can let us have your questions. But I've got a few to lead off with if no one minds. The question of how these ideas got around is one that really interests me. You've mentioned service as mercenaries, but I wondered if you had any opinion on how much might be informal as a result of trade and communication between Rome and Gaul rather than formal military service.
Yeah, I mean, it's so nuanced that I couldn't really get into it, but it's massive, right? So the Gauls are fighting against the Romans for 200 years. And the idea that they didn't pick up or something wasn't transmitted through osmosis is absurd, right? And I'm not saying there are cultural factors which could have mitigated how much was, so think of like the French refusal to adopt the longbow in the 100 Years' War because they favored cavalry. And that comes down to aristocratic ideology. But the fact of the matter is, most of the scholarship, or a lot of the scholarship coming out now, the Romans weren't fighting in a way that was any different to anyone else. And yeah, there's a lot of cross-cultural, and also, we also have to factor in that if Cisalpine Gaul was never truly Gallic, and the Etruscans, the Picenes, and the Gaulosicans never went away, then there's a lot, we have to at least entertain the idea that there was a transmission of military technology or military tactics or approaches and all that jazz that is not visible in the archaeological record. So yeah, I think it's a massive thing. And in terms of mercenaries as well, we tend to see mercenaries in the ancient world as that was your job. You would leave home, was it go east, young man?
Yep.
And there's an argument in an edited volume coming out soon that kind of argues that mercenary service was almost, it could be annual. So there's that aspect of that coming back. And there's also the same thing. It's like, well, if I'm constantly getting defeated by your tactics, at some point you have to kind of navigate the narrative of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting a different result.
Because you mentioned the Roman cavalry using military training / techniques from the Gauls. I just wonder if you had a more specific reference to that, and if possible, any idea of how they picked up on that?
Yeah. Okay. So in the 1st century AD, Roman imperial training techniques, there was the X, Y, E, M, N, A. So there was 3 techniques, and it was all revolving about casting a javelin.
Okay.
Now these were parade ground training techniques, but although you can't transfer it one-on-one to the battlefield, it's kind of echoing what you need as skirmisher cavalry. And again, like that's the other misconception, is that cavalry is merely cavalry at this point in time. They're either skirmisher cavalry with javelins, or they're essentially dragoons. They're infantry who dismount.
On that tactical note, I had a question for Davina Duckworth on YouTube. So when you say heavy infantry, do you mean full body armor, or do you mean the role that they're providing in combat?
Yeah, okay, so again, a good question, another misconception. Heavy and light is just a distinction on the role you play. It doesn't necessarily mean the army you fought with. So if you think about it, Hellenist, so the phalangites and phalanx of Alexander the Great are considered heavy infantry because they fought as line infantry. But towards the end of the Hellenistic period, they weren't even, the rear ranks didn't even have armor. And even in Alexander's period, they're not heavily armored. And small shields like strapped onto their over the shoulder. So
are we talking tactical role melee versus skirmish? Are we talking the way they're organized? Are they shoulder to shoulder versus dispersed?
Yeah, I guess the easiest way is to define it through line infantry and skirmishers and dual purpose. So light, heavy, medium, I guess.
Nice. And you mentioned that older men, when the two, they've aged out of the light infantry and they're moving into the line infantry. In practice, is that less effort? Because I always think of the pre-gunpowder warfare, clashing of swords, etc., as something really, really draining both physically and mentally.
Well, I mean, look, the way that the Romans were set up is that the triarii, the oldest and wealthiest, did the least fighting. And again, that's kind of like an echo of a social hierarchy, right? Like, I've earned my place, young man. You go do it for me. And it's exerting power. Rather than kind of like, I need to prove myself as a warrior at all points in my life. And that's kind of what I was saying about like commanding from the rear. Once you've got that authority and it's codified, you don't need to be, the image of the barbarian berserker. You don't have to be Ragnar Lothbrok at the front.
I mean, we talked about the sort of socio-political changes let the Gauls fight in a not this traditional barbarian manner. It occurs to me that the Roman Republic had its entire political structure was based around its warfare, essentially. So basically the classes voted in order that they would fight in the battle. So the richest, who would form the triarii, voted first. Then the poorer and poorer eventually, until you came down to the proletariat, who might fight as velites. However, the Gauls don't seem to, at least as far as I could make out, the Gauls don't seem to have adopted anything on this scale. Is it plausible that they were that well organized without such a formal political hierarchy to back it up as the Romans have?
If anything, I guess if I've interpreted this question correctly, that these divisions in the army are naturally occurring in any society. And you touched on it rightly that most of the proletariat, and especially in the Roman army, you weren't allowed to fight. And fighting for Rome was in itself an extension of your social power or your class and authority. In terms of the Gauls, we just don't have, the reason we're enabled to kind of discern this from the Romans is that we have the literary evidence. And so the only way we can do that with the Gauls is through archaeology and through the weapons they're buried with. But again, as I said in the thing, it's a juggling match, because like, who holds the most authority? Like, how do we interpret who holds the most authority? Because at Montebellum, it appears that the most important thing you were buried with are domestic goods, so like a strigil that you would use to scrape yourself down with. And so yeah, it's in a way it's a little bit of an oxymoron.
Well, I mean, to a certain extent, I think you gave the answer, because one of my questions was going to be, if we no longer understand, Roman dominance of the peninsula as a discipline factor, then how do you explain it? But I think possibly, effectively, everyone's doing the same thing, but the Romans, because they're gearing their whole political system up to it, are just perhaps doing it better than the Gauls, and that might explain it. That brings us on to a question from Nothing to Lose on YouTube, which is what happens to so when the Gauls territory is conquered by the Romans, what happens to them? Do they stay? Are they forced out, as you get sometimes in colonies in South Africa?
No, they stay essentially. So the Senones are the first to go in like 284, something like that. But that's Rome. That is the key to Rome's expansion, right? The quid pro quo is we just beat you. But we're not going to change anything amongst like your local government. So your elites get to stay in power. But when we go to war, we want your troops. And like 50% of Rome's armies during this period are allied troops. And there is no centralized Prussian officer corps teaching these people how to fight and command. In terms of the Chinomani and the Insubres, they keep their arms. Like there's a whole thing where like a Roman governor tries to take the arms off the Chinomani and they go ballistic. And if you think about it in a geopolitical sense, Rome's still like consolidating its rule south of the Po. So it's advantageous for them to keep the Chinomani and Insubres, who already have good relationships with people's other side of the Alps, as a buffer state. So no, they don't disappear. And that's the thing. It's like what I was trying to get across with migrations is these are not just, it's not like a plague of locusts just wiping people out. I mean, even if we take into account the much larger migrations with the Goths and Vandals, they don't take everyone out. They just move in and assimilate, much like today's migration.
I mean, you mentioned the Prussian example. It's interesting because when Prussia takes territories between sort of 1860 and 1870, when they set up Germany, they have to send trained soldiers to their new provinces to install their military systems. The problem is you probably can't reconstruct it from the documentary evidence, but it would be really interesting to know if Rome is having to do the same. If it's not, then it points to the Gauls already being sophisticated enough. They don't need to forcibly instill those military practices. But I guess that's lost to time.
Yeah. And look, I would point people towards Fernando Quesada Sanz and his work on the Iberians and Celto-Iberians. And essentially he argues that the reason why the Gauls are throughout the Mediterranean are so in demand is because you essentially just bolt them onto your army. Like they have nuanced regional differences in the way that they fight, but for the most part, they're conditioned to operating within these armies, within the parameters of how you fight.
Just on a source-based question, so you've looked at cemeteries, formal burial. I wonder, is there any large body of specifically battle casualties that has ever been found in Europe from this sort of period, or do they just not, they've not been tracked down yet?
Certainly not in northern Italy, but much of that has to do with the fact that 70% of Italy's agriculture comes out of the Po Valley, and we just don't have the sediment archaeology. I'm just trying to think of the closest one. There's a battle in the Bronze Age, Talent's Valley, where there's like thousands of people, but no, like there's no mass graves that we can study combat trauma on the body. I mean, it would be lovely if we had it, but unfortunately, that's the game we play.
Yes. I say apologies, Barbara. I think I preempted your question there, but it's hopefully more or less the same as you would have asked. I guess we're coming to the end of our time. So if people need to get away, then do feel free. I know we started a little bit late, but thank you for coming. I do have one sort of remaining question I'm sort of trying to formulate. The severed heads, okay, it's in Roman sources. Are you really saying it came from nowhere?
Oh no, I mean, like everything, there is a kernel of reality in everything.
Mhm.
It's just the degree to which it's sensationalized.
Yeah.
You know, it's like the Romans are very good at saying everyone's a savage because they sacrifice people.
Mhm.
Well, when Rome was under siege, they sacrificed 2 Gauls and 2 Greeks.
Yeah.
So, of course, it happened, but the degree to which it happened, we have to approach it with a sense of skepticism.
Yes. This, as someone who does the 19th century, this is the thing that amazes me about this period, is that classical ancient historians are able to reconstruct so much with such fragmentary evidence. So thank you very much, Alastair, for today's talk.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
Now, if people perhaps want to read more of your work, where should they look?
Go to academia.edu. I've got some stuff up, and my thesis is coming out next year as a book.
Yeah.
So if you're happy to wait a year to read the ramblings of a madman, pick it up then through Routledge.
I was going to say, yeah, it's absolutely fascinating. I'll keep an eye out for it because it's something, there's such a richness of scholarship behind it. It'd be nice to read more, but thank you for
No, thank you.
today's talk. Thank you also to Emily behind the scenes for taking care of the feed to YouTube, and thank you to Laurie for the technical support. Thank you to you for the audience for joining us today, whether that's on site as our small but select audience proves, or virtually. Our talk next week comes from Nathan Jopling of the University of Birmingham. When you think of pirates, you think of fear, whether it's the skull and crossbones or Blackbeard putting lit matches into his beard to scare people off. Nathan takes us back to the early days of piracy's golden age to look at how this sense of fear was a useful phenomenon for more than just the pirates. For details of that event, check our website, which is royalarmies.org. Follow us on the social media of your choice, or follow us on Eventbrite to get notification of these events as we post them. But in the meantime, thank you again for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you next week.